I think, with all due respect, you are not though enough in your criticism. I mean, for God's sake, these broken lines are not poetry. Writing a large number of lines with only a few lines that contain poetic elements is not writing poetry. These writings are, at best, emotional texts or poetic prose, not prose poetry. One of the jokes of our age is that people cannot distinguish these two. You see what he did? He misspelled the word thorough. Classic move. But wait, there's more. Where's your poems, though? I'd love to see what such a harsh critic could come up with themselves. So, these are 2 comments I've received across some of my poetry review videos, and if these comments prove one thing, it's that you can't please everybody. Now, it might not seem this way based on how I decided to start this video, but I genuinely try to make sure comments don't get to me. However, these comments stood out. Under that first comment, someone replied, "You write a poem then if you're such an expert." And while I appreciate this person seemingly going to bat for me, well, I haven't really shown my original poems on this channel before. If the defense is that this person's critique is invalid because they haven't shown off their poetry, well, the same critique should be used against me, and as you can see, it has been. It's true, I don't really share my poetry in a public forum, but there are a few reasons for that. For one thing, most poetry journals won't let you submit poetry that you've already published elsewhere, even on a personal blog. And since I'm trying to get my work published, I keep it mostly to myself for now. Except for some drafts I share with my patrons on Discord when we do prompts together, shameless plug. But even if I did share my poetry, and even if it was really, really good, would that change the validity of my critiques toward other poets? Or on the other hand, if I showed you all my poetry and it was utterly terrible, certainly that would affect the validity of my critiques, right? Like I said, I try not to let comments get to me, but in truth, this comment has been on my mind for a long time. From the moment I saw it, I knew I wanted to make this video as it prompted the question, do good critics have to be good artists? Recently, I did a video called Good Poems by Bad Poets, and I want to reiterate what I said in that video. The idea of good and bad in art is highly subjective. Everyone is bringing their own experience to the table. In many cases, there are technical measures for art, this is true, but it's kind of impossible to separate a given critique of a piece of art to how that piece of art makes you feel. We often make fun of IGN for the whole "this game makes you feel like you're XYZ," and yeah, a lot of game critics do over-rely on that phrasing, but it's not hard to see where it came from. You do want a piece of art to make you feel something, and you especially want a video game to make you feel like you're in another world for a while. So, with art being so dependent on the audience's subjectivity, what good are critics anyway? That's an excellent question, and I want to return to it later. For now, let's focus on our main topic. Do good critics have to be good artists? If I asked you to think of the most famous critic ever, who comes to mind? For me, and for many of you, it would probably be Roger Ebert, and by extension, Gene Siskel. Even if you don't think they are good critics, you can't deny their fame and influence. Siskel and Ebert are credited with shaping modern film criticism, but at the same time, the two were criticized themselves for essentially sensationalizing film critique. But that's important to note. The way I see it, there are sort of 2 schools of thought when it comes to criticism. There's criticism as an intellectual pursuit, but then there's also criticism as a means of entertainment. And don't get me wrong, those 2 things don't have to be separated. When you watch Drew Gooden pull apart a terrible movie, there is still intellectualism in that, and when you read a book critique from the Kenyon Review, there is certainly still entertainment value in that. I think the reason YouTube critics have become so popular is because they often do strike that balance between intellectual and sensationalist. Granted, there are certainly critics here on the platform that lean either too far to the entertainment side or too far to the intellectual side. To each their own, of course. Forgive me for losing focus there, let's get back to the matter at hand. Siskel and Ebert are both influential and controversial, this is true. But what's really funny is that they weren't even all that entertaining initially. As Matt Singer writes for LitHub, on opening soon at a theater near you, Siskel and Ebert didn't look terrified, they mostly seemed bored. There was no energy to their reviews, or to the back-and-forth crosstalk debates that became their trademark. As Singer explains, Siskel and Ebert weren't even the true draw of their own show. Initially, people tuned in to see the movie clips packaged as part of the criticism. These days, we can see trailers and clips pretty much anytime we want with the internet, but in the mid to late 1970s, that absolutely was not the case. Eventually, the show evolved to be about the reviewers, so much so that the program was eventually called Siskel and Ebert. What's funny is, part of what made Siskel and Ebert so popular was the subjectivity in the reviews. The two disagreed a lot. Gene Siskel was often extremely critical, while Roger Ebert was perhaps too lenient. He was maybe so lenient that a lot of his negative reviews became instantly memorable. What's more, he often included personal anecdotes in his criticism. With all of that in mind, I think what makes Ebert so iconic and valuable as a critic is how he made criticism itself so accessible. It's intellectualism versus entertainment again. It wasn't that Ebert lacked intellectualism, just that his brand of intellectualism was easy for the average moviegoer to digest. Much like art, criticism itself is subjective. You might think Siskel and Ebert were both terrible critics. Even so, that doesn't change their influence. And this is where common consensus comes in handy. That's another reason critics are so valuable, for their consensus. Listening to one critic alone probably doesn't help you place the quality of a work. But many critics altogether? That's a different story. But the question remains, were Siskel and Ebert good artists? As far as I can tell, Siskel never tried his hand at entering the movie industry beyond his reviews. Roger Ebert, on the other hand, well, he tried movies, but, how to put this? Unless you're a Roger Ebert fan or a major film buff, you probably have not heard of these. Ebert is credited as a writer on 3 of Russ Meyer's sexploitation films, those being Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Up, and Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens. Reviews of these films are extremely mixed. These movies were understandably pretty shocking when they first came out. In the present day, people look back on them with sort of rose-colored glasses, appreciating the satire that audiences of the time might have missed. But it's hard to lump all of these movies' faults under the umbrella of, well, it's satire. That's a little weak in my opinion. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls came out before Siskel and Ebert's partnership, and Siskel wrote a pretty scathing review for the movie in the Chicago Tribune. Let me read you the first 4 paragraphs. Russ Meyer had a talent. He could make an occasionally good-humored skin flick for about $70,000. Meyer's cheap films made money. Sometimes they were erotic. When it was announced that Meyer's next film would be made for a major studio with a budget of more than $1 million, anticipation of a sexy, funny film ran high. Unfortunately, Beyond the Valley of the Dolls unfolds with all of the humor and excitement of a padded bra. There is not one erotic scene. There is very little nudity. Meyer's photography of his new wife, Edie Williams, could be grounds for a divorce. Boredom aplenty is provided by a screenplay which for some reason has been turned over to a screenwriting neophyte. Meyer had previously written his own films. Yeah, that's gonna be an oof from me, but remember, Siskel was usually, famously, pretty harsh, so his review isn't gospel. That being said, the first couple of paragraphs make it sound like even he was ready to accept this film on its own terms, and it didn't even meet those expectations. If you've seen these films, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If I'm being honest, I'm not sure we'd remember these films as fondly if Roger Ebert hadn't played a role in their development. Like, Russ Meyer had a name for himself, for sure, and there's still a lot to say about his films. But it's telling that the movie most famously attached to Ebert has significantly more reviews than Meyer's other films, with the exception of Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. But even with all that in mind, making a movie is so difficult, or rather, breaking into the film industry is really difficult. It's far more likely that a person would be a successful film critic than a successful filmmaker. On the other hand, with literature, anyone can pick up a pen, and self-publishing is easier now than it ever has been. In the modern day, it's technically easy to be a writer, but it's harder to become an established literary critic. As with many film critics these days, the easiest way to become a critic from the ground up is with YouTube. And that's how you get people like yours truly, charmed I'm sure. In fact, if you're trying to build a brand for yourself, it's almost better to become a critic on YouTube. There are 2 videos I often find myself coming back to on this platform: Video Game Donkey's Game Critics and Video Game Donkey's Game Critics Part 2. That first video especially is jam-packed with incredible observations about professional criticism in general. It surprises you that Donkey is so verbose and erudite. One of his major points in that video is how game reviewing outlets have such decentralized opinions. You don't really know whose opinion you're getting at IGN or Game Rant as opposed to, say, the lone peanut butter gamer or Arlo or Donkey himself. If I could extend that argument further, when a movie review comes out from Variety, a lot of people forget that there's an individual writer behind that piece, or maybe 2 or 3 writers on rare occasions. But even with that being the case, most people will just label it as Variety's review of whichever given movie. The same isn't always true for literature. For example, when I read this review of Jane Allison's Meander Spiral Explode, I know that it's from Ruth Joffrey and not from the Kenyon Review itself. Even so, the Kenyon Review signed off on Joffrey's criticism, not necessarily agreeing with it, but finding it valuable enough as a piece of literary critique to publish. Even so, it's hard for Joffrey to build an audience like this in the same way that a YouTuber can, face-to-face with their audience. And yet, if you compared Joffrey to your average booktuber, it's not hard to see which one would be taken more seriously, no? That was a bit of a tangent, wasn't it? Going back to the matter at hand, becoming a serious, respected literary critic is a hard thing to do these days. And in my personal opinion, I think it would be sort of unlikely to find a good literary critic who's a bad writer. I might be speaking from a biased perspective there, but just think about it for a second. Anyone, and I mean anyone, can form a pretty educated opinion on a film because most of us have seen a lot of movies. The older you get, the more you realize what works and what doesn't. As such, anyone can pick up a camera and start doing film reviews, and they might pick up a lot of traction. On the other hand, while we all keep watching movies throughout our lives, a lot of people stop reading once they're done with school. And I'm not blaming them. There are a lot of factors that would push them away from reading, many of them economic factors. But what I'm saying is it would be hard to be a literary critic unless you either A, pursue a career related to English literature, especially in academia, or B, pursue writing. In any case, I don't think you can be a good literary critic unless you read a lot of diverse literature. Which should be obvious, but you'd be surprised how many movie critics don't diversify their movie intake. Even so, it is still possible to be a good literary critic and a bad writer. If you look at Wikipedia's list of American literary critics, you'll recognize a lot of these folks as famous writers, like Edgar Allan Poe and T.S. Eliot. But a lot of these names probably wouldn't be recognized outside the world of literary criticism at all. Granted, that doesn't mean they're bad writers. Obviously, they write criticism well, don't they? Still, for the sake of this video, let's talk about Harold Bloom for just a second. You can disagree with Bloom about a lot of things, I know I certainly do, but you can't deny his influence on literary criticism. In many ways, he's kind of the literature equivalent of Roger Ebert, though I wouldn't call his work easy to digest. Even if you're familiar with Harold Bloom, it may surprise you to know that he actually wrote a work of fiction of his own. The Flight to Lucifer received wildly mixed reviews, and even Bloom himself got to a point where he wished he'd never written it. But much like Roger Ebert's movies, The Flight to Lucifer had, and still has, its fans. It's just not what Bloom was known for, and that's okay. He is prolific as a critic, and there's nothing wrong with that. To hold his novel against him and say that it invalidates all of his other writings would just be silly. I can't imagine anyone who's serious about reading, writing, and analysis doing something like that. Recently, I put out a video about The Critical Drinker, and you should really go watch it if you haven't. One commenter pointed out, the fact Drinker and his grifter friends chose to bury his movie, proof of concept TV show pilot, while throwing the actress in it under the bus, speaks volumes. And I have to agree in some respects, especially when it comes to throwing the actress under the bus. Really awful. And don't get me wrong, dunking on Will is fun, but I don't think this is the most productive way to do it. If we want to say that Will is a bad filmmaker, then yeah, for sure, point to Rogue Elements. But just because Rogue Elements was bad doesn't mean he's a bad critic. He's a bad critic because he's dishonest and inconsistent. Like how in the same video he can say themes aren't relevant to film criticism, but then also say that he'll bring them up when he thinks they're relevant. But I won't beat a dead horse. To say that Will is a bad critic just because he made a bad movie sort of does a disservice to the discourse in my opinion. Granted, there's a more nuanced way to frame it. You could say that Will doesn't understand filmmaking as much as he purports to, and as such it's no surprise he made a bad movie. But it's like I pointed out with Harold Bloom. Nobody would hold his poorly written novel against all the important work he did. To say Harold Bloom misses the point in literature or fiction probably isn't true. Oppositely, to say Will misses the point in film would be true, but not merely because he made a bad movie. So, do good critics have to be good artists? Well, as one of my patrons said, you don't have to know how to fly a plane to know it's bad when one crashes. Even casual moviegoers and casual readers can often identify when something isn't working. You may have noticed I went on a lot of tangents throughout this video. That's because I got to thinking, what actually is the purpose of criticism anyway? I won't lie, these days it honestly feels like most people go to critics to have their own opinions validated. But ideally, the critic exists for the consumer, which is why it's so bad when critics start to form ties with the people and organizations they're supposed to be criticizing. That's yet another reason why independent critics on YouTube have become so popular. While writing this video, as I got to thinking about this question, do good critics have to be good artists? I started wondering about its inverse. Do good artists have to be good critics? I think it's rare that you'd see someone proficient in something who can't deconstruct that thing itself. Most often, when you see artists with odd takes about art, it's usually when they go beyond their medium. The most obvious example to me is Hideo Kojima. Most people would argue that Kojima makes great video games, but has some off-the-wall takes about certain movies. Or Shakira, who is a talented musician, but had a crazy take about the Barbie movie. Or Snoop Dogg, who recently said Lightyear has made him afraid to go to the movies because of the lesbian kiss in that film. Like, dude, what? Off the top of my head, I can't really think of a good artist who's a bad critic of their own medium. But I'd argue that's because most well-known artists don't really need to go into criticism. If you're already an established artist, why risk picking fights with other artists in your industry? Now, that's not always true in the literary world. Authors write reviews for each other all the time, but again, that's a little different when nearly anyone can become a writer, even outside of the publishing world and even without a literary background. However, I honestly think the opposite is true too. If you're a good critic, I don't know that you really need to be a good artist. If you have a niche and you fill it well, there's still value in that, no? Another video I often return to on this platform is Drew Gooden's Leaving the YouTube Bubble, another video which deals largely with criticism. But as Drew points out, a lot of YouTubers feel they need to prove themselves and aspire to something more than YouTube, which is kind of silly when you think about it. Like in Lily Singh's case, why go from being your own boss with total flexibility and the support of millions of subscribers to making late-night television content for like thousands of people? To quote Oscar Wilde, "But surely criticism is itself an art, and just as artistic creation implies the working of the critical faculty and indeed without it cannot be said to exist at all, so criticism is really creative in the highest sense of the word. Criticism is, in fact, both creative and independent." As I mentioned earlier in this video, criticism is itself a form of art. Criticism relies on expressing emotion and conveying meaning. There is value in being a good critic, even if you're not a good movie maker, fiction writer, poet, whatever. And maybe I only reach this conclusion as a means to soothe myself. If I don't get any fiction or poetry or essays published, I can still console myself with the fact that my reviews are still valuable. Even if you disagree with me, I hope you can still see the value in what I try to do. Ultimately, I'm trying to teach you something. I want you to think critically. Artists need critics, just as critics need artists. Watching a critic you disagree with can still help you understand what you respond to in art, and why. And I should note, this video is sort of just scratching the surface of all this. There are so many areas of criticism I haven't addressed, like food, visual arts, music, video games, and more. Even sports commentators could potentially fall under the umbrella, and not all good sports commentators were good athletes. But that's where I turn the question over to you, viewer. Do you think good critics have to be good artists? Do you think good artists have to be good critics? What do you think of me as a critic? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem by one of my patrons. This is Dead Man's Musings by Penguinite. What foreign tides should embalm, what cenotaph should be? When shall the star-crossed be calm, by the soft whisperings of the sea? There is no dirge music here, but the gulls chant, to remember the claimed fear that o'erlooks the living who can't. Should the night encroach the day, and the sun follow, so that time will pass away, and diminish the pretense of sorrow, that claims to follow that legacy of camaraderie, but I am dead and left to wonder, who will remember, and who will join me? For the chance to see one of your pieces at the end of my videos, you can consider supporting me on Patreon too. For as little as $3 a month, you can see my attempts at poetry in the community Discord. You can also see videos early, and get priority review for your work on the second channel. You're seeing my patrons scrolling across the screen right now. I genuinely cannot thank them enough. If you want to support the channel in other important ways, please do all the things the algorithm likes. It would help a lot. You can also follow me on my socials if you want. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft.